I am the Assistant Director for Academic Affairs at the African Studies Center at MSU. I welcome you all to our second Eye on Africa of the semester. And as I explained last week, for those who don't know, Eye Africa is the weekly speaker series that the African Studies Center organizes every semester. We invite scholars, policymakers, people with sound knowledge to come share their knowledge, their research with the Africanist community. And because of COVID-19, we are holding the lectures virtually this semester. I'm shortly going to introduce our speaker of the day, John Doyle-Raso, but before I do that, let me remind everyone that there will be a question and answer session after John's talk. So if you have a question, please use the raise your hand option or write your question on the Q&A section. John will answer as many as time permits. The lecture will be recorded and it will be available on our website afterwards. So I'm gonna go ahead and introduce John. So John Doyle-Raso is a PhD candidate at Michigan State University. His dissertation in progress is about the creation and implementation of the national policy for wetland conservation in Uganda. He has a dual master's in international and world history from Columbia University and the London School of Economics, for which he researched the water politics of the Nile Basin in East Africa. He has a bachelor's degree in peace studies and sociology from McMaster University. His other research interests include histories of invasive fish and plant species in Lake Victoria. Thank you, John, and very much welcome you. So I turn it to you now.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Yeah. Oh, lag. Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, for signing in today. I appreciate it. This is something that I'm have been working on for a while, but I'm still working on, and so there are a lot of things I'm excited to share. But I'm also looking for whatever feedback you might have would be very much appreciated. Thank you as well to the African Studies Center for organizing this, and in particular to Awa Sar, who we just heard from, as well as Nicole McKenzie for setting up each part of this process. Sorry, I'm just gonna share my screen. Okay, great. I think that should be good. If it's not, you'll tell me, I guess. So just as a quick abstract before we start, I'm just going to outline the presentation. Uganda was the second country in the world with a national wetlands policy under the International Ramsar Convention. One key means of implementing this policy has been through focusing on the conservation of great crowned cranes. Ornithologists estimate, at the end of the 20th century, ornithologists estimated that there were about 100,000 of these birds left in Africa. Sorry, that there were about 30,000 left from 100,000 at the start of the century. And that roughly maybe a third of these were in Uganda at the time. Uganda has long been one of the major places where these birds live. And the bird is also the emblem of Uganda, which is something we'll talk about today. This decline in the crane population was of concern to crane conservationists because cranes, to many conservationists, serve as what's called an indicator species, meaning they reflect the status of the ecosystem that they live in. And because of their recognition to people across Uganda, both because of its status as the national emblem, as well as a number of other reasons, it worked as what would be called a flagship species, which is to say something that would draw a lot of attention to Ugandan wetland conservation, serve as a flagship for it, a flag. One issue though is that people saw this indicator or this flagship in different ways. And so to promote crane conservation to people with different interests, conservationists reproduced sometimes conflicting representations of cranes, including Ugandan nationalism, localized stories about cranes, as well as a pro-monogamy discourse that Christian eulogists initiated during the AIDS crisis. Conservationists also worked against the global animal trade to ensure that cranes remained in Ugandan wetlands as indicators and as flagships. They organized public crane counts and other activities, including especially participation by children across the country, both to produce scientific data as well as to spread awareness about the crane as an indicator and as a flagship. And so this presentation is largely, it's about efforts by Ugandan ornithologists and other conservationists to interest different kinds of people in crane conservation. It contributes to interdisciplinary scholarship about how interaction between people about how people with different interests shapes the production of knowledge, and in particular conservation. In research about place-based conservation, these kinds of interactions are usually framed as antagonistic. Studies of species-based conservation, I think, sometimes identifies more cooperation based on shared scientific epistemologies. This presentation historicizes cooperation across different epistemologies that link place and species-based conservation, wetlands and cranes. It also advances scholarship about the global trade in live rare animals by narrating the development of a national conservation network in an exporting country, rather than looking at importing countries with the creation of intergovernmental agreements. Together, this offers a unique view of the creation of a nationwide conservation program and how it worked in practice. How people using different epistemologies coordinated a national response to what were localized changes in a lot of different places around the country by identifying connections between communities, animals, and environments. Next slide. Okay. So this cartoon appeared in the New Vision, which is the government-owned newspaper in Uganda in late 2018. The editorial cartoonist of the newspaper, Mr. Raz, here he depicts a flock of breeding crowned cranes meeting a cob at this shield here, thereby forming an image of the Ugandan coat of arms. The cob asks, "Hey, do you cranes know what family planning is?" To which one of the cranes replies, "We want to send a message to investors who degrade wetlands that destroying our bedrooms will not destroy our stamina." Another crane in the background sits on a large pile of eggs, and then there are pairs of breeding cranes flying above, surrounded by hearts floating around them. But also draw your attention to the cartoon cob, which has genitalia. These are not part of the official coat of arms. In addition to altering the coat of arms, Mr. Ross, the cartoonist here, he took artistic license with the depiction of cranes as biological entities. While ornithologists as conservationists tried to humanize cranes in order to draw attention to them by frequently pointing out that they're monogamous for life and that they tend to breed in the same place. This humanization, was also then associated with people trying to reimagine cranes' reproductive behavior in other ways. Unlike in the cartoon, breeding cranes are territorial. They wouldn't flock like this, and they only lay 2 or 3 eggs at a time. They wouldn't have a big pile. Beyond these kind of superficial differences, the fundamental resilience of this crane population that we see here, I think undercut a message that was being propagated by the ornithologists who were working for conservation, which was that if the nesting place of a pair of cranes is destroyed or degraded, they won't find a new one. The caption that Mr. Raz gives at the bottom, I haven't included it, but as well as the newspaper article that it follows, basically say that while the population had been declining for some time, it was beginning to rebound. This interpretation contrasts with the view of the founding director of Uganda's National Biodiversity Database at Makerere University. He told me in an interview that the trajectory still remained downward, even at the time. But despite these discrepancies between how people have seen the cranes, because of all sorts of different interests, Ugandans have found cohesions between the politics invoked here. We see class inequality, we see environmental conservation, and we see reproductive issues as well that the COP is bringing up. This is largely because of the efforts of a group of ornithologists and people who participated in their citizen science projects, and the newspaper personnel who played a role connecting them by broadcasting the efforts of the conservationists. Well, about half of the New Vision's readership in the early 20th century was based in Kampala. They have more reach to people outside Kampala in Uganda than any other print media in the country, and so they were the means that conservationists chose to try to enroll people around the country in this program. The newspaper offered kind of straightforward coverage of their activities, but it also offered things like letters to the editor, reproductions of local stories about cranes as spiritual beings, things like that. And this kind of broader approach to the crane is why the author of their romance and sex column called Dr. Love wrote, "I am now passing as a very responsible conservationist, because if you got the chance to see Mr. and Mrs. Crane preparing for a hot secret between the sheets, you would learn a few lessons in that subject." And he said that when they're not in heat, they are a peaceful pair and only get annoyed when some policemen participate in evicting people. So he promoted crane conservation because he said that we should tell our grandchildren that there used to be a monogamous bird called the crane. I hope the word monogamy will not be extinct by then. So here, Dr. Love was framing crane conservation both as a way to promote environmental integrity, monogamous relationships, as well as national unity. The campaign for this relied really on people picking up these messages and doing it on their own. The government put little funding into enforcement or promotion of the campaign and instead relied on individual initiatives as well as international NGOs and a national NGO, which forms really the last third of the presentation. And it's partly because of the autonomy required of people to participate in this, if they were to be part of crane conservation, that the Kampala-based conservationists who try to promote it have really had little control over the discourse regarding cranes or what people say or do about them. People have applied ideas about crane reproduction to debates that conservationists didn't necessarily intend to pursue, but the work that they have done has largely aligned with the priorities of the government, especially since the 1990s with neoliberalism, which is to say limiting spending, decentralizing responsibility for social services. And we see this in environmental conservation, we see it in reproductive issues in this presentation, as well as in other things that other scholars have addressed. So this narrative begins with an analysis of the cultural context into which crane conservationists broadcast their message, revealing that, well, many people thought about cranes in terms of interpersonal relationships. Few thought about them primarily in terms of wetlands or anything really place-based. Then I talk about the campaign that started in 1986, during which time government personnel focused on crane protection as a means of wetland conservation. Finally, I look at the second phase, 1998 onward, when NGO personnel took the lead. No, sorry, I should have shown that picture earlier. There's non-cartoon ones. So through that narrative, my argument then is that the focus of wetland conservationists on crane reproduction as a place-bound monogamous phenomenon enabled the creation of a campaign that people around the country discussed in a variety of terms that the Kampala-based conservationists had not necessarily anticipated. These discourses are rooted in a variety of perspectives on cranes that sometimes conflicted with each other, but the work of them often aligned with Ugandan government priorities, decentralization, and neoliberalism. So that said, yeah, that's a map of the distribution of great crown cranes across Africa. You'll see that around Uganda, the dark green sections mean that the core areas, according to the interpretation of the conservationists in 2015. You can see that they're concentrated mostly in southwestern Uganda today, although historically there's also been a large population in eastern Uganda. Still, you can see that most of the country is shaded in as at least being part of the range. Yeah, so the first section about cranes and Ugandan cultures, I'm going to cover a few different things here. So when Ugandan conservationists first began this project to conserve cranes, they broadcast their messages into a variety of different cultural contexts in which people had a lot of knowledge about the bird, just not necessarily the kind of knowledge that conservation is valued in terms of environmental science. And sometimes they supported contrasting interests, for example, ethnic traditions from the Southwest, including from clans and constitutional monarchies. And on the other hand, Ugandan nationalism, which don't necessarily align with each other. Or conversely, another tension would be on one hand, advocating this pro-monogamy discourse, cranes as faithful birds, but on the other hand, also discourse about marriage practices in the Southwest and sometimes the Southeast, which didn't necessarily align with this view of monogamy, although those are the places where most cranes lived in Uganda and still live. Ugandan media have addressed the capture of cranes for trade and for local domestication, at least as much as any other aspect of crane conservation. They highlight this in one entry in the romance and sex column of the New Vision's competitor, The Monitor, Melody's Pillow Talk. She claimed that her aunt said, "You will never meet Mr. Crane without his wife, nor meet Mrs. Crane unaccompanied," and that she should therefore get the eggs of a crested crane. Fry them nicely and eat them with your husband. Melody tried it. She said, she says that, well, this was breaking the law since the crane is our national symbol. Our politicians have been known to eat state coffers dry. Additionally, some Ugandans kept cranes as pets. The earliest attestations of this come from 1988. Beyond capture and domestication in households, there's evidence of diverse forms of popular interest in cranes that predated the conservationist campaign in the late 20th century. One narrative featuring a crane was recorded in 1922 by a missionary in a book of what she called folklore stories based on her experiences and information that she gleaned from the Uganda historian Apollo Kagwa. Included, without particular attribution, is a story in which the daughter of a Kabaka disliked going with her family to the Sese Islands, so she flew away on a crane. Another narrative I found is recorded by historian Jonathan Earle. He interviewed what he called elderly interlocutors in Uganda. They told him about Chiganyira Chibuka, a healer and anti-colonial organizer, whom elders told him when he was imprisoned for anti-colonial politicking, he mounted a large crested crane that flew him over the prison's walls to the pillars of Kungu rock, a prominent rock nearby, where sympathizers believed that a two-headed snake transported food and money to and from the summit. So here the crane is a vehicle of liberation, and its proximity to the two-headed snake, which is the figure of the Uganda creator deity, was auspicious. Still, these stories really have nothing to do with wetlands. If anything, they're more about moving around rather than any particular place. So that idea is something that conservationists ended up bringing in. In addition to these two narratives, cranes have broader roles in some cultures in Uganda, particularly they're used as clan totems, which in Uganda would designate not only something about an individual's heritage, but also particular animals and or plants that they must protect in real life, like around them. The conservationist preferred example of this clan is the Bahinda clan in southwestern Uganda in Ankole. This is the clan from whom all the kings of Ankole come, and their primary totem is the crane. The king's crown or almost similar featly bird was seen as only next to killing a king. However, the origins of the Bahinda in Rwanda make their political authority a source of controversy in the southwest, and therefore efforts to conserve wetlands on that basis. Beyond their status as totems, protective taboos, so these were mostly concentrated in the southwest. There are some examples from outside, but really mostly in the southwest. In eastern Uganda, taboos have mostly been grounded in the national status of the crane rather than in local cultures or local ideas about the crane, which mean that the crane really in the east has a lot less influence than it would in the southwest. 3 ecologists who studied it in 2009 studied the situation or summarized the situation. They said, there are some not so strong traditional values attached to cranes, but most people are aware of its status as a national bird. Which is to say there's some protective taboo there, but not much. As I say, taboos were stronger in the southwest. According to an interview that I did with Stephen Ranyezi, he's an Ankole elder who founded and directed the Ndere Center in Kampala, and whose mother was from the Bahinda clan. He said that Ankole people associated with cranes with marriage is as late as the mid-20th century. 1968 would be the cutoff he personally gives. As part of the wedding when his sister got married and the following ceremony was not performed, he said that as part of wedding preparations, women often performed what were called akachera for the bride-to-be. They gathered by going from house to house in order to collect her, singing songs that included lyrics about marriage and calls that imitated the crane. As I say, ended by 1968. Still, ideas about the crane in personal relationships endured. A 1982 poem in a newspaper framed the crane as a symbol of love, peace, reconciliation, and beauty, specifically among Ankole people. It's called Crested Crane Revered, and it was an Ankole tribute to the crane. But yeah, so the poet didn't specify what kind of love, though. Stephen Ranyezi would find it, he said, strange that people would promote crane conservation in the southwest based on monogamy, because he says it's not a value there. And in the southeast, polygamy has been common, at least throughout the late 20th century, it's based in Islam as well as in a number of local cultures. In contrast to symbolizing the politics of authority in southwestern Uganda, the crane also has major pride of place in Ugandan nationalism, the most prominent example being on the Ugandan flag. It didn't get there by popular means, though. It was put there by Frederick Jackson, Uganda's governor ornithologist. He put it there when he designed the flag, the first flag of the protectorate. You can see it's the Union Jack and the crane. He was an ornithologist and he liked cranes a lot. When the first independent government took power, they changed the colonial flag, but they kept the crane. It even survived the initial draft of the initial version of the first flag of the Republic of Uganda. It was rejected because allegedly the color blue was not suitable for the African sun and it would fade. People who liked this flag pointed out that neighboring Sudan and Tanzania had blue in their flags and seemed to be doing just fine. But according to the committee to redesign the flag, they said that this was because they kept the crane anyway. They redesigned it because of the colors, possibly for political reasons, probably for political reasons. But they kept the crane. They said that because it's friendly, gentle, and shows the peace-loving character of Ugandans. Moreover, the crane, it resonated with a lot of Ugandans. There's a box in the National Archives of records from, they had a national competition to redraw the flag after this one was rejected. And there's a lot of support for the crane really based on this idea that it's a gentle bird. There's one proposal for a chameleon, but again, based on the same idea that a chameleon is gentle, it uses its tongue as opposed to violence. And so the crane, it became Uganda's national symbol because of top-down decisions, but it has kept this position, at least based in part on popular support from people who wrote into it, or people who were able to write into it. But journalists disagree about the extent to which Ugandans, today take nationalist pride in the crane. A writer for the Monitors and other newspapers' Independence Day supplement of 1998 lamented the tragic fate that had befallen the crane. He said that the crane as a species had declined across the country because, quote, politics has degenerated to a shortcut to wealth. The public knows this and therefore sees no reason why they should pay any attention to national symbols. Still, Ugandan wetland conservationists, they place their hopes in the possibility of interesting other Ugandans in wetland conservation by promoting the crane, if not entirely based in nationalism, then based in nationalism as well as a range of other interests. So this campaign began in 1986, which coincidentally was also the year that the term flagship species first appeared in print. It appeared in relation to Brazilian primate conservation. But in Uganda, two major things happened this year specifically. One is that the new resistance movement of the NRM took power in 1985 and consolidated it in 1986, and that year banned the large-scale drainage of wetlands based on this emerging concept of wetland conservation. The second development was that then graduate student Paul Mafabi, he began researching the effect of wetland drainage on crane reproduction at the Doyle-Raso scheme in southeastern Uganda. At this point, I offer my condolences to the friends and family of Mr. Mafabi. He passed away this week. Soon after visiting the rice farms in the southeast, the NRM put him in charge of the newly formed program to develop a national wetlands policy. However, having a national policy under a government that wasn't really able to enforce it nationwide posed a challenge. The solution to this was to frame the policy in a way that would appeal to people to do it without any kind of compulsion. The way they chose was to focus on the crane, which is the national emblem and known to Ugandans for many other reasons. Cranes were not the original focus of Ugandan wetland conservation. When the NRM banned wet-scale drainage, they did so not because of cranes, but based on concerns about decreasing soil fertility and changing microclimates. Places were getting warmer and drier. But these concerns were quickly joined by interest in crane reproduction in 1986, by which time an international network of crane conservationists had already solidified in the International Crane Foundation based in Baraboo, Wisconsin. This network supported Ugandans, but they did not see their concerns as a priority until the early 21st century. A 1993 comparison of crane species characterized the gray crown cranes as relatively safe. They ranked them as the least likely of the African cranes to go extinct, and the 6th least likely of the 15 crane species globally to go extinct. 1996 survey said that they were the most abundant African crane, but then by 2005, they identified them as the most rapidly declining, still abundant, but rapidly declining. This time, still on the IUCN, International Union for the Conservation of Nature, still on their red list as least concern. In 2009, Ugandan and other conservationists lobbied to have it uplisted to vulnerable, and then in 2013, it became uplisted again to endangered. So ornithologists began studying it in the mid-1980s, but in the last study published before this 1986 ban, they weren't terribly concerned. Macquarie professor Derek Pomeroy, who taught a lot of the other people who I talk about today, he suggested that his population was growing in 1980. He based the study on records that he had been making over decades about a decade in various parts of Uganda. But in particular, eastern Uganda, as well as 2 sites near Kampala, a farming area and a garbage dump. The fact that cranes were able to adapt to the farm and the garbage dump also seemed to be an indication that they were not necessarily a conservation concern. He told the 1983 International Crane Workshop, which is something that the International Crane Foundation organizes for researchers around the world. In 1983, he said that because they occur commonly on these kinds of places, there's no immediate likelihood of them being adversely affected. He said that in 1938, Governor Jackson described the distribution and abundance of cranes in terms which apply well today, suggesting that there has been no great change since those years, and that there were breeding sites for cranes in a lot of national parks. But in 1986, Mafabi did his master's research analyzing how the Doyle-Raso scheme in southeastern Uganda had been affecting crane reproduction. He did this research based on the recommendation of prominent conservationist Dorothy Itori. He then presented his preliminary findings in 1987 at the International Crane Workshop in China. He used Pomeroy's findings to frame his own research, but he struck a different tone than Pomeroy had at the previous International Crane Workshop in India. He said that cranes in southeastern Uganda had been experiencing low success in their breeding rates because of rice farming, as well as because of the capture of chicks by people who kept them or sold them. Based on interviews with local residents, he said that there was probably a downward trend in the population, as well as based on his own observations. So by 1987, the situation they identified was that cranes were both facing fewer places to breed in, as well as that once cranes bred, their eggs or their chicks would then be taken. So when he was done, he presented his findings. He began this narrative. He said that birds are faithful to their nesting sites, and therefore the headwaters of swamps should not be reclaimed. This will ensure the continuity of water supply and ensure adequate areas for cranes and other birds to breed. So besides doing this sort of scientific work and offering this intellectual basis for wetland conservation in Uganda, he was also working to organize crane conservation through the wildlife clubs of Uganda, which were a group of school-based organizations that started in the 1970s under, in association with the National Parks body. Mafabi, he had a role, I believe he wasn't the chairman. He worked for the wildlife clubs of Uganda in those years. And he organized these clubs to conduct the first national crane count in Uganda. At the time, there were about 400 member clubs, so that there were clubs in about 400 schools. And so their participation enabled the generation of records on a scale that was much larger than Mafabi or Pomeroy had been able to do as individuals. To learn how to organize this count, he went to the ICF headquarters in Baraboo, Wisconsin for 1 month in 1987. He participated in their Foreign Fellows program. He studied in the methods that they had used for the Wisconsin crane count and developed materials and slideshows that he then took back to Uganda. He trained coordinators in 4 districts who in turn enlisted 40 additional teachers and club sponsors to get kids to conduct this crane count. They conducted in November 1988, 485 sites in 10 districts in southeastern and southwestern Uganda. The newspaper, New Vision, was also key in organizing crane conservation in these years. The NRM launched this newspaper in 1986 when they took power. There had always been a government newspaper since the Uganda Argus really solidified in the early 20th century. When the NRM took power, the New Resistance Movement created the New Vision as their newspaper. They launched it in 1986, and the newspaper quickly aligned itself with the NRM's claim that they would be different from the previous administrations. And one of the ways that they were trying to distance themselves from previous Ugandan administrations was saying that previous administrations had been environmentally destructive and were going to be the opposite. It took a little bit of time for wetlands to make its way onto the New Vision agenda. Early in this time, so the late 1980s, most of the items that it was publishing were about deforestation rather than wetlands. Deforestation was really the major concern. But their coverage expanded a lot then in 1987 when they hired Unjachira Amoti, who became the first nationally prominent journalist in the country to focus on environmental issues. In 1988, he began a study of wildlife conservation, including 2 stories about Mafabi's work and a series of articles about the export of animals, especially birds, including cranes, from Uganda and other African countries. His first story about Mafabi's work focused on the broader context of issues that Uganda was facing than on the crane. But his second story in particular was about the crane. He gave Mafabi space to comment on the broader significance of the crane to wetlands across Uganda. Soon, Mafabi's position rose. In 1989, the NRM started a national wetlands conservation and management program. They put him in charge of it, although at this point there were two people. The initial plan was to develop within 2 years a national policy that would enable the government to fulfill its obligations under the International Ramsar Agreement they had agreed to when they made this policy. But it started small, as I said, 2 people. And so they suggested that the government should encourage what they called self-regulating community groups to manage the hunting of birds in wetlands. 6 years later, not quite the time frame, but still 6 years later, they became the second country in the world to enact a policy under the Ramsar Agreement. And then to give the policy legal teeth, by 1998, they passed 4 laws, including the current national constitution, that explicitly safeguard in some way wetlands. But the institutional basis for enforcing these laws has been weak. As recently as 2007, Mafabi remarked that they have a low capacity for surveillance and monitoring due to a shortage of staff and funds. At most, we have 6 employees responsible for this task nationwide. He said in an interview, not with me, with another scholar, that although they frequently visit the wetlands surrounding Kampala, the rural areas are seldom monitored. And so government officials really have therefore pursued policies that can be implemented autonomously by different people across the country. The policy they created is also noteworthy because, well, Ugandan wetland conservationists were building on a well-established tradition of referring to the crane as an indicator species, something that people in North America and other parts of the world have been doing. Making this concept foundational to a nationwide program was an approach that few people had tried, both regarding cranes as well as flagship species more broadly, which is maybe something we can talk about later. Ugandan's leading role in the field was evident at the 1993 African Crane and Wetland Workshop in Botswana that the ICF organized. It was attended by over 100 crane conservationists from 18 African countries, plus Japan, the Netherlands, Saudi Arabia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. The opening day was basically, it was a 6-hour workshop that Mafabi conducted. He called it Development of a National Policy for the Conservation and Management of Wetland Resources, the Ugandan Experience. But with time, not that long, not that much time after 1993, came changing ideas about farming. And the wetland conservationists began to focus less on cranes. They began noting that rice paddies support large numbers of birds, not necessarily cranes, but other birds. Even at the Mon workshop in 1993, the Mon Botswana workshop, the researchers from Uganda suggested that rice was not so bad, saying hundreds of bird species were relatively common on the fields, and many species were restricted to these rice fields for about half the year. It was the only place many of these birds could live. They said that cranes could even tolerate some cultivation, saying that sometimes they nest near rice fields. So this policy work that they had been doing gave conservationists a different understanding of the relationship between rice, birds, and people than they had gained through the biological research they did earlier in the 80s. When Mafabi then shared his experiences developing policy with the 7th International Conference of Parties to the Ramsar Convention, he said that we now recognize that wetland conservation is not just about birds, but also about human survival and welfare, as well as wildlife survival. Therefore, we now have to answer tough questions such as how much rice can be grown before a wetland changes its ecological character. So initially, they tried to raise interest in wetland conservation based on the relationship between wetlands and cranes, but they ended up changing this approach based on the challenges of policy implementation, using cranes or other things. When their focus on this waned, NGOs, in particular Nature Uganda, stepped in and began doing this work. So let's start with Nature Uganda. Nature Uganda was originally the Uganda branch of what was called the East Africa Natural History Society, which was founded in Nairobi, but later a Uganda branch was created. It closed under Idi Amin. Makerere faculty revived it in 1989. It attained official registration as an NGO in 1995. It rebranded from the East African Natural History Society to Nature Uganda in 1998. A change that was led by ornithologist Achilles Biaruhanga, who had just joined the organization after finishing his work under Derek Pomeroy. As a bachelor student, he gathered data for Pomeroy on birds in relation to the changing ecology of Kampala. He was then encouraged to join Nature Uganda to try to rejuvenate it by Pomeroy as well as other people. Within a year of joining, they developed plans to survey Uganda and identify what they thought might be the most important places in the country for birds. And they called it important bird areas, which was a system that ornithologists globally had been developing. But the utility of IBAs, important bird areas, to the campaign for crane and wetland conservation was limited. Quote, due to the diffuse nature of wetlands and a lack of basic information about them, delimiting particular wetlands as discrete areas was difficult. And so the authors elected only to designate a few representative sites, including wetlands. Besides, large birds like cranes dispersed at low densities across wide areas would therefore not be effectively conserved by this approach, they said. Beyond this, as I said, the breeding cranes are territorial, and so they're quite dispersed, and so it would be hard to conserve any one particular place for crane reproduction, given that they don't like to have each other nearby when they're reproducing. So they would have to depend on, the wetland conservation campaign would have to depend on applying this concept of an indicator species in a different way. In 2002, ornithologist Jimmy Muhebwa brought such an application as well as funding for it from the international, from Disney, the Disney Foundation, when he joined Nature Uganda. His master's work, which he started in 1998, built on Mafabi's master's work. He examined cranes in 4 districts across southwestern, central, and southeastern Uganda. In the year 2000, he met one of the co-founders of the ICF, as well as a Kenyan crane conservationist from Western Kenya named Maurice Wanjala. With Rich Belfast, the ICF co-founder, and Maurice Wanjala from Western Kenya, they got the grant from Disney Foundation, another grant. With half of this grant money, he joined, half of it went to Uganda, half of it went to Kenya. With the Uganda half, Muhebwa joined Nature Uganda as the first project manager for, they were now launching a crane and wetland conservation project with this funding. IUCN funding followed in 2003 for additional work in southwestern Uganda in particular. Muhebwa grafted this project onto a strategy that Nature Uganda had already been using for other forms of conservation called site support groups. Because they said that, one, this is something they were already doing, and two, most of the places where Nature Uganda was doing this work was outside protected areas, and therefore the kinds of places where you might actually find cranes. So Muhebwa helped create 12 management committees for crane and wetland conservation in the Southwest. But it came to encompass nearly 200 sites, incorporating the work of farmers, children, and administrators. Today, the approach they now use is called community conservation agreements, CCAs. But again, it's an extension of this strategy of creating autonomous site-based projects for particular wetlands and the crane populations that live there, to be enacted by the people who live there in particular. He did other initiatives, including a monitoring program called Adopt a Crane and the Crane Custodians in 2010. And it was Muhebwa who made the explicit connection between cranes and monogamous love, part of Nature Uganda's outreach strategy. Muhebwa is the person in the middle. This is a meeting of crane custodians. You can see they have crane print shirt. Muhebwa is the person with the blue hat in the middle. It's obviously the one doing the talking. He borrowed the idea of explicitly connecting cranes and monogamy from eulogies that he heard at Christian funerals in the 2000s, when he said that, quote, everyone in Uganda knew someone who died from AIDS. The behavior-focused approach to AIDS that was being taken by the government and NGO actors in Uganda has featured abstinence and monogamy prominently. Christian eulogists use knowledge about a widely familiar bird, crane, to connect it to prevailing discourses about AIDS. And crane conservationists like Muhebwa use these ideas to promote wetland conservation based on pro-monogamy discourse. Nature Uganda personnel, including Muhebwa, have also begun using the crane to promote family planning and environmental conservation simultaneously through a collaboration based on the argument. They say that family planning will reduce pressures on families themselves and local ecosystems. It's a partnership between Nature Uganda, the ICF, and the Margaret Pike Trust, which is a London-based family planning foundation, as well as the Rugurama Hospital in Kabale district in southwestern Uganda. Byaruhanga, the director of, the executive director of Nature Uganda, explained the partnership, he said, because of the cross-cutting nature of the Sustainable Development Goals and the demographic realities of a world with a fast-growing population. The use of a crane as an icon of family planning is at odds with the image presented in the cartoon reference at the start of the chapter, in which the cob implies that their population is rebounding because they don't know what family planning is. Just an entirely converse interpretation. So they've interpreted it in a variety of ways, including as a basis for social service provision related to environmental issues, health issues, family planning. Nature Uganda also collaborated with another conservation NGO, the New York-based Wildlife Conservation Society, to do the first public count in Uganda since 2000. They did this in 2004. The study took place, 2004 to 2006. It was an attempt to show the spatial distribution of crane breeding sites outside protected areas. The Minister of the Environment explained that they know that cranes use wetlands, particularly seasonal wetlands, for breeding, but they did not know which wetlands. They figured mostly the Southwest and the Southeast, but they didn't really know much about the particular places beyond that. So the way that they conducted the study was by making a questionnaire for children that the New Vision newspaper and the wildlife clubs of Uganda would publicize. They encouraged children to respond by offering prizes from the national men's soccer team, who are called the Cranes, t-shirts, as well as for 5 winners, an all expenses paid trip for the child and a guardian to Kampala to attend a match. Again, they said that this was intended both to produce data as well as to interest people in crane conservation, just as a flagship, and to create some awareness there. The New Vision editorial column that was published the day after the survey launch asserted, "We need to urgently find out cranes' numbers so that we can protect them better. The crown crane is our national totem. Just as a clan cannot harm its own totem, Uganda should do everything possible to cherish the crown crane." It also published several warnings in a number of articles that Uganda would lose its population like Rwanda already had. Its population has since rebounded, but at that point, it seemed that it had been extirpated from from Rwanda, sorry. So the newspaper was building on the idea of obligations regarding clan totems and extrapolating them to the nation, and used the neighbor Rwanda as a cautionary tale. The study ended up showing conservationists that while they thought that breeding was confined to the Southwest and the Southeast, and confirmed that it mostly was, they also got a lot of responses from central and northern Uganda that they didn't expect to find. And so their knowledge continued to depend on these kind of public contributions. The researchers themselves followed up on most of the reported sites. Logistical and other issues prevented them from getting to a number of them. They selected places to visit based on places that the government officials had already visited and determined to be part of crane range, as well as places that they thought there might be cranes. But even getting to many of these sites was challenging for them, and it required the further help of questionnaire respondents, local informants, and GIS systems. Kampala-based researchers, therefore, that they could produce knowledge about crane reproduction based in part on their own observations, but due to a lot of constraints, they relied on a number of other people to do so. The other major constraint to estimating the crane population was the fact that they weren't just changing because of environmental changes, but also because of the global crane trade, which meant that a large number of these cranes lived outside Africa in particular. In 2006, a former president of the German branch of the World Wildlife Fund wrote that the most sought after species of crane and the one most commonly kept in captivity are African gray crown cranes. There are probably more of these birds in captivity outside of Africa than in the wild, was the estimate in 2006. Even for people who aren't particularly interested in cranes, these birds are striking, as you can tell by those numbers, but also, I think this still is interesting, when the sensationalist Netflix show Tiger King introduced its audience to an exotic animal auction somewhere in the southern United States. They did so with the shots of 2 animals. They show a camel being paraded in front of a bunch of people, and we see this crane here in a cage. So yeah, it's because it is quite a striking looking animal, and it's part of why it's been of interest to so many people. And so they've been exported to zoos and to private collectors in North America, Europe, the Middle East, and East Asia. Of those in zoos, which is to say of those that we have a few more records about, the vast majority have been taken from East Africa. 1992 tabulation found that of those registered with the system, only 13 came from Southern Africa, and the other, I think, 200 or 300 here. Other 200 or 300 came from Eastern Africa. They live in the kind of mixed species exhibits that I'm showing you pictures of here. Their role here is to create a sense of place, not as indicators of wetlands, but to show the large mammals that are being featured in these landscapes in what might feel like a more natural environment. A recent different example would be the picture on the bottom right, which is a picture of a water bird habitat at a zoo in Denmark. But again, it's this kind of mixed species exhibit, and cranes are there giving a sense of place. And so conservationists therefore expanded their work to include not only efforts to preserve the places in which cranes reproduced, but also to prevent the removal of crane eggs and crane chicks from these places. In 2006, Nature Uganda people partnered with South African conservationists to form the African Crane Trait Project. So it's the same groups of people as well as the same argument for crane conservation. They wrote that if we lose cranes, we're losing wetlands we depend on. Without cranes to indicate ecosystem status, this means that wetlands become harder to monitor. And without cranes as flagships, public interest becomes harder to generate. Within a year of its founding, the ACTP released 2 reports. One was about their first major planning workshop. The other was their first major research study. It was a study in southwestern Uganda near the Tanzanian border of 5 sites led by Jimmy Muhebwa. They found evidence of smuggling into Tanzania by working with local people in Masaka, Rakai, and Isingiro. They found that 5 Tanzanian traders, 2 of whom were based in Kampala, were transporting cranes across the lake. Since conducting the research, Muhebwa has involved other Ugandans to try to stop the trade. At a conference, they assessed it and found that from 1996 to 2005, they said that Tanzania and Sudan were the 2 countries exporting wild-caught cranes. It was illegal to do so in Uganda. And they noted that there were no wild populations of these birds in the Sudan, bolded in the original. There's a very strong likelihood that Uganda forms part of the origins of the trade involved, but that the illicit status of the crane trade in Sudan and Tanzania allowed them to continue exporting these birds. In 2013, trade was suspended from Rwanda, Tanzania, and Uganda, which had already banned it. And so in 2020, according to Muhebwa, the main basis for the crane trade has now become taking cranes through a number of corridors, again in southwestern Uganda, but not to Tanzania, but to the Democratic Republic of Congo. Their participation in this project is in part an attempt to conserve national heritage. It's an extension of the campaign's idea that crane conservation is vital to the reproduction of the nation. But this particular attempt arose only in the last few years. A longer running effort by Ugandan conservationists to manifest this viewpoint about crane conservation and interesting people, future generations in Uganda in environmental conservation has been the sustained engagement that I mentioned a couple times involving children in research, both in the production of data and the spreading of awareness about research. Byarruhanga explains the strategy by saying that, quote, "The challenge in talking to adults is that some of them have already purchased plots in wetlands, which is not the case with young people who will take messages and practice it. The strategy also raises money for Nature Uganda. Students, including those in university, have tended to comprise the largest proportion of Nature Uganda's paying members. They were 339 of the 609 in 2002. In 2016, they remained just over half of the group when membership had grown to a little bit over 3,000 people. And so for these reasons, Nature Uganda has really, they've continued their strategy of nature conservation by engaging children. They've met with different levels of success in different parts of Uganda. In southwestern Uganda, crane pairs are a visible part of the landscape for many people, not in southeastern Uganda. Many children there, they said, have never seen it, but they have heard it call. The children were, however, not very sure that they will live to see it, since they also intend to become rice growers in future. But the connection is it's not always based simply on economic interests. According to an interview that I did with Gilbert Taibwa, who is Muhebwa's assistant for running the Crane Custodian program, Taibwa said that he's developed a relationship. He told me a story. He developed a relationship with a boy in Kabale whom crane traders had approached for help in locating crane chicks and eggs. Taibwa said that the boy said that these two men riding a motorcycle came and they've been offering money. The amount of money they offered is nothing compared to what a bird would fetch on the international market, but it would still be a lot to him, and it's an amount of money that Taibwa can't match as part of his conservation work. Still, apparently the Taibwa says that the boy decided to work with him rather than the traders. And so we see Ugandan children continuing to play vital roles in crane conservation in relation to keeping these birds in wetlands. Sorry, almost done. So just in conclusion, this idea of turning an indicator species into a flagship species. Conservationists saw the bird as an indicator species, but they needed it to be a much broader thing to interest people in a lot of different ways. But people see cranes differently depending on who they are, how they interpret crane behavior, how they interpret crane symbolism. And so conservationists have tried using different discourses to reach different audiences. Sometimes these messages contrasted, as in regard to Ugandan nationalism and Ankole politics, or pro-monogamy discourse and marriage practices in the places where cranes live. In the late 20th century, this is when crane conservationists became aware of the decline in crane populations. They began their campaign to conserve it by drawing attention to cranes' bedrooms. This work began in 1986 when Mafabi researched how drainage for rice farming affected crane nesting and how people capturing crane eggs and chicks was also affecting it. But the government had little ability to enforce these changes. So by the 1990s, they'd really come to favor spending cuts, decentralization overall, not just for crane conservation, but most service provision. And so conservationists began this program of trying to convince people to conserve wetlands by changing their own environmental practices. They made the crane the flagship of their efforts based on its multifaceted values as a symbol that would attract all kinds of eyes in Uganda. However, a few years after running the National Wetland Management and Conservation Program, Mafabi and others felt more keenly the limits of crane conservation as a means of protecting wetlands. NGOs then took up the mantle of the campaign for crane and wetland conservation. So their focus on crane conservation as a place-bound monogamous phenomena is what enabled the creation of a campaign that people around the country discussed in a variety of terms that the Kampala conservationists sometimes anticipated, sometimes did not. These discourses are rooted in a variety of perspectives that sometimes conflicted with each other. But overall, most often, it seems to me that the work of conservationists, both in relation to the environment as well as then in broader issues related to reproductive health and so forth, this work is also aligned, continued and consistently aligned with government priorities of decentralization and neoliberalism in social service provision. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. That was really interesting. So please use the Q&A to write your question or raise your hand. My colleague, Isaac Palumbu, will be reading the questions. So please go ahead and start writing your questions or use the raise hand symbol to ask your questions. So while we wait for people to type their questions, I was just interested. I just wanted to know, I was curious, how did you get interested in the subject, John?
Little step by little step, I guess. The start of this project, I guess, would have been looking at the creation of wetland policy in Uganda and looking at it in relationship to rice farming. I was mostly looking at wetlands and water and rice and looking at that nexus, but then birds became more and more important. And the more I trace back what each individual was doing, I find the cranes were really at the core of this. And in particular, finding out that Fabi had started this work in 1986 with the rice and the cranes and talking about the global crane trade as well helped me see how some of these connections then continued over time based not necessarily on Mafabi's work, but other students of Derek Pomeroy and other people interested in wetland conservation.
I think we have a question, Isaac. You muted, Isaac.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
The first question is from Dale and Agnew. In many societies, making a particular species a god or icon makes it more difficult to provide adequate veterinary care or conservation. Did you see this in any indigenous societies in Uganda?
Personally, no. I think it would depend what you mean by icon, I guess. But so on one hand, you have it as an icon in the sense of being a totem, in which sense I haven't encountered anything that would make it suggest that it would be difficult to care for them. Maybe in the sense that sometimes people want to keep them as pets, and ornithologists would argue that that's not necessarily a good idea. But I think those are kind of rare instances. And so overall, in terms of totems, I would say it doesn't function in that way. But as symbols of monogamy and as something that people might use to enhance their own personal relationships, that can be, as I said, an inhibition. The other thing then would be its value as an icon of the nation of Uganda. Because it's an icon of the nation of Uganda, and since 1956, I believe, it's been illegal to hunt them. Many people are, according to researchers, many people are reluctant to discuss any practices that might be construed as having any kind of relationship with doing something improper with the crane. And so in that sense, it can become hard sometimes for people to gain access to knowledge about them because of the legal iconography around cranes. Thank you. This is a very good question.
Thank you, John. The next question is from Anne Lutomia. Thank you for your presentation. This is just a suggestion. As a stamp collector, I suggest you look at East African colonial stamps, then focus on Ugandan stamps that focus on the crane as a site for spreading awareness or spreading the cranes as a national bird.
Thank you, Anne. I like this suggestion a lot. Actually, the background of my computer was it's a stamp with a crane on it. It's Uganda, again from the colonial era. I found a little bit of its use in that way. There was a proposal to create a couple crane-related stamps as well. I should return to that. It's that box of there's a big box about the crane as a national symbol that was gathered from the 1960s, from the 1960s in Uganda. Thank you for that. I didn't realize it might be something that, thank you. I like that suggestion a lot. Thanks.
The next question is from Dr. Jamie Monson. Thank you, John, for a fascinating presentation. The points you made about monogamy and reproduction suggest that a gendered lens could be useful for this project. Could you let us know your thoughts about this?
Yes, excellent question, Professor Monson. Thank you. This is something that I'm continuing to try to figure out how to incorporate into this. It is something that, on one hand, I can kind of, I'm going to deflect a little bit and say that this is something that I really want to pursue through further oral research, to the extent that I have done oral research regarding this. When I've asked crane researchers about gender dynamics within the crane research community, I've gotten some different answers, but it's something that I'm still grappling with. I know that's really not a satisfying answer, but that's where I'm at right now.
We need more questions. I could ask a question as we wait for more questions to come. You touched a little bit on folklore and how the crane is regarded from a folkloric perspective. I am a musician and an ethnomusicologist. I've always wondered to what extent the crane is incorporated in lyrics, in popular culture, in when people express themselves. Have you found any of that in songs?
So the interview that I'm basing that on, as I said, was with Stephen Ragnesi at the Ndere Center. I've been in communication with someone else at the Ndere Center about their archives. He says that they have a collection of some of the Akachera in there. I'm currently working on trying to get access to it. But, in particular, because of this, so this is something that I learned about, the Akachera I learned about in January, February, and then I was communicating with them to try to learn some more on the archives, but then the work was interrupted in relation to COVID, and I'm trying to get that communication back up and going. Yeah, the Akachera transcripts, which are hosted at the Ndere Center in Kampala, would be the only examples that I could okay. Yeah, it's something that if you were to collect oral histories in the Southwest from people who remember these kinds of things being sung in the mid-20th century, you would be able to find. But as far as I know, the best bet for the collection so far would be the Ndere Center.
Thank you. I have a question here from Dale and Agnew. Elephants have been harvested or collected and shipped to other countries, to zoos, as a means of raising revenue for conservation programs. And in some cases, due to local overpopulation. Any discussion of similarly harnessing the demand for cranes to help the conservation mission?
Yeah, great question. The way it's framed in Uganda has, I know this is a debate between governments in a number of different African countries. The position of the NRM broadly has been that interest in Ugandan animals should be harnessed in terms of economic benefit through tourism, and that tourism for seeing cranes and other birds is the way to see economic benefit from international interest in these birds. In Tanzania, conversely, I think you might find, which is in the crane conservation literature I've been reading, seem to maybe place less emphasis on conservation. Tanzania might be a place to look for that kind of approach.
Thank you. A question from Philip F. Young. What sparked your interest on this topic in this location? I ask since there are several options to you, locally and globally. Just curious.
No, thank you. That's a good question. Very briefly, I had been interested in questions about water politics in East Africa for quite some time. And then I began studying them as an undergraduate. As a master's student, I kind of took a broader view, and I looked at questions about water politics in East Africa and the Nile. And what I found, one of the things that I found most interesting about it was how the water politics of the Nile had changed the way people thought about and used wetlands, and that a lot of this was happening in Uganda. And so I began focusing on that, and through that, stuff about the crane became one of the more prominent focal points for thinking about changes in ideas about wetlands in Uganda.
Here is a question from Ryan Carty. Enjoyed the presentation. How does this research on cranes fit into the rest of your dissertation research?
Great, thank you. So this is one of the ways that people tried to implement the wetlands policy. My dissertation is kind of half and half. Half of it is about the history of why the policy got made and how it got made, and then the other half is a history of efforts to implement it, which I framed about, which I'm framing as being one in terms of cranes, two in terms of other upcountry efforts, and three in terms of other urban efforts. So. It's part of that implementation half where the focus of it all is about having this policy.
Okay. We don't have questions currently.
All right.
Well then, thank you so much, John. Thank you for
Thank you.
lecture. Thank you for the talk. And thank you everybody else for coming and for being with us this afternoon. And please join us again next Thursday, same time, 12 p.m. Eastern time. And we'll be receiving Kwesi Mpini from University of Michigan, and he'll be talking about Kete songs. So the title of his talk is Petitioning the King, Kete Songs, Lineage and Kinship in Ashanti. So I hope you'll be able to join us next Thursday. Thank you again, John, and thank you, everybody. See you next time.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, let's see one more question.
Oh, there is new, okay.
One more just popped up.
Oh, there is a question here.
Known for its wetlands and
Thank you for your presentation. Southwestern Uganda is known for its wetlands, thus its closeness to the love of cranes. Dr. Kalumbu, to respond to your question, some traditional dance movements follow the dance styles of the crane. Wow, that's very, very interesting. Yes, you find these kinds of phenomena across the continent, from West Africa in, musicians, drummers, imitating certain animal movements. And certainly in Zimbabwe, there's a group which follows the hornbill, which uses the rhythmic noises that the hornbill makes in playing their instruments. So it's very, very interesting how folklore, nature, music, and expression have a sort of a way of coming together. And I think that's another side of this negotiation on space and representations and meanings, where you find cranes showing up. So it's quite an interesting and fascinating phenomenon. But thank you very much, Judith, for that. That's very interesting. I want to pursue that and see how that actually happens in that Ugandan context.
Thank you very much, everyone. Appreciate it a lot.
Thank you.
Okay, bye then. See you next Thursday, everybody.